Could one 17th century political philosopher have found the solution for all of our political and social problems? Could giving absolute power to one person actually be the way to bring peace and order to our society? Could it be even the only way to bring peace and order to our society? As crazy as these questions might sound, in this episode, we'll be looking at Thomas Hobbes, a pivotal political philosopher from the 17th century, and his argument for the defense of these claims. Indeed, as we'll see, Hobbes maintains that the only way to guarantee sustained peace in a society is to cede all authority to an absolute sovereign or monarch. Stick around to hear why. But to warm us up and prepare us for what's to come, let's begin this episode with a little thought experiment. Picture yourself as a bank robber. You and your co-conspirator attempt to rob the local bank, only to be caught by the police. There were no witnesses now, aside from you and your obvious accomplice, the two people who are actually robbing the bank. So when you're taken in, the police immediately separate the two of you and shuffle you both off to different interrogation rooms. Once there, they tell you and your partner the same instructions, and they're pretty simple. You can either rat your accomplice out or not. Now, if neither of you agrees to cooperate with these instructions, then you're both told that you will each serve 1 year in prison. So if neither of you rat on each other, you'll each serve 1 year in prison. But if you are to rat on your accomplice and they don't rat on you, or vice versa, then you get off scotch-free with no jail time while the accomplice serves 5 years in prison. Or if they rat on you, you get 5 years in prison and they get off scotch-free. However, if both of you rat on each other, then each of you will go to jail for 3 years. So what are you to do? Rat on your accomplice or stay quiet? If your accomplice stays quiet, then it's certainly in your favor to rat on them. After all, there'd be no prison time for you in this scenario. But if you stay quiet, then couldn't they do that very same thing? Couldn't they rat on you and you'd then be stuck going to prison, rotting there for 5 years, wishing you'd testified against them? So to rat or not to rat, this is the dilemma that you face. Now, I'm not actually coming up with this thought experiment. It's a rather famous one. You may have heard of it, actually. It's called the prisoner's dilemma. The thrust of the problem is that because it's in your interest to minimize your prison sentence, it's actually also in your interest to rat on your partner, hoping that they won't do the same. But if your partner also rats on you, then you'll be going to jail for 3 years. So maybe it would actually be in your interest to stay quiet. But can you trust your accomplice to also stay quiet and hope for a mere 1 year in prison? Or will they rat you out and now you're stuck in prison for 5 years? It's quite a conundrum to be in this situation. Now, the prisoner's dilemma actually illustrates a kind of paradox in practical reasoning. If both parties are acting rationally, that is, if both parties are seeking their own self-interest, it turns out that both of them will opt to spill the beans on their partner, risking or guaranteeing even 3 years each in prison, which is odd that if they both were to stay quiet, they'd only have 1 year in prison. The incentives of the experiment themselves make it so that there is always a risk of the other person ratting on you. And so long as this risk exists, it's more rational for you to rat, even if it means going to prison for 3 years, because you can't trust that the other person will not confess. It's just the most rational thing to do, to rat the other out. So the paradox is that that jail time can be minimized by just both parties keeping quiet. But if both actors are acting rationally, neither of them will actually keep quiet, and hence their prison sentences won't be minimized. While the prisoner's dilemma famously illustrates some key themes for something called game theory, Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher of interest in this episode, utilizes similar reasoning to argue that we should consent to being ruled by an absolute sovereign or monarch. So in order to protect our interests, the most rational thing for us to do, Hobbes thinks, is for us to cede all authority to a single, absolutely powerful individual who can guarantee through their wrath that order will be maintained in society. So let's jump in then. Welcome to another episode of Ideas Through Time. Welcome to Ideas Through Time, where we explore the thoughts of history's greatest Western philosophers. I'm Zach Agoff, your host, here to make the transformative power of philosophy accessible to all. Wow, we're already in the third episode of this mini series on social contract theory. Time really does fly, especially when you're writing these episodes with a newborn in the other room. So, like I do. So I apologize. I'm a day late to this recording. Um, Having a newborn is quite a commitment. So I appreciate your patience, everybody. Um, Nonetheless, that's what friends do. They keep their episodes coming out for the entertainment of the masses. So you're welcome. 2 episodes ago, in episode 6, I gave a general intro to the social contract theory. There, I discussed two central themes in political philosophy, specifically the themes of legitimacy and justice. What makes a political authority authoritative, that is legitimate, and what makes a political authority just. Now, social contract theorists attempt to answer each of these questions in terms of a kind of contract that exists between political authorities and their constituents. Different social contract theorists frame and leverage the contract in different ways, but the contract itself is utilized by all of them. The first social contract theorist that we've been attending to is a man named Thomas Hobbes. If you missed the last episode, it might actually be helpful to go watch that. Actually, both episodes 6 and 7 are linked in the description below. Hobbes is an interesting philosophical figure for many reasons. For one, he represents a really significant shift away from religious reasoning and toward secular reasoning in the political and scientific domains when it comes to both establishing justice and political legitimacy. But he also represents a really radical view that might feel pretty foreign to our modern eyes. Yes, he maintains that the best form of government is a sovereignty or a monarchy where power is localized in a single figurehead. His argument for this relies actually on a thought experiment. So consider for a moment that there's no actual governing body, no authority that you could call upon when you're being robbed, no military to rely on when you're being invaded, no court system to handle property disputes, or anything of the like. It's every person for themselves, no governing body that is operating whatsoever. Now, Hobbes thinks that in this scenario, all out war would erupt. It would be everyone against everyone. All we would need, he thinks, are three conditions to guarantee this. The first is obvious, because I've already mentioned it. It's the condition that there is no governing body to deal punishments or manage disputes between people. This condition is called the condition of the state of nature, a state that has no political authority ruling over a given social group or location or anything like that. Second, Hobbes needs to establish the condition that humans are inherently self-interested creatures. Humans are beings that will pursue their own ends as they see fit, and without external pressures keeping them from pursuing their self-interest, like for example, knowing that murder is going to lead immediately to prison. When disputes eventually erupt over resources, things could quickly turn violent between individuals. People could commit murder against one another. Hobbes thinks this condition actually is patently obvious, because if humans are so good, why do we lock our doors at night? Why do we have weapons to protect ourselves? Why do we lock our treasures away in safes? We do this, he thinks, because we know inherently that there are nefarious people who will seek their self-interests even in the face of possible punishment. This is with a ruling political authority. Imagine if there wasn't one. Now, the third condition that Hobbes needs to establish is the condition of scarcity. Resources need to be scarce for his thought experiment to yield the results that he desires or even deduces from these conditions. That is, that the state of nature is a state of all out war. In order for this second condition to yield conflict, our interests need to conflict with one another. After all, if there was more than enough to go around for everyone, then everyone could pursue their self-interest without it bumping up against another, so to speak. But Hobbes thinks that there is a scarcity in the state of nature. There would be no infrastructure, after all, to guarantee that there is enough to go around. Food would have to be produced through the effort of individuals rather than systems. And if you have a successful harvest in the state of nature, what's to stop me from going to your land, killing you, and taking your food, especially if there isn't much of it around? This would be viable, according to Hobbes, in the state of nature. And it's a consequence of the fact that resources would be scarce. So, with these three conditions, no governing body, everyone's operating on their own self interest, and resources are scarce, Hobbes thinks that we're guaranteed a state of all out war. There's just no avoiding it. Notice, however, that under these three conditions, security in our individual perseverance is completely undermined. Humans would live in the state of nature in a continual state of fear for their lives, unable to trust others and fully ensure their security. They couldn't enter into agreements with others for their mutual benefit without the risk of being stabbed in the back. Individual rationality in the state of nature, it would seem, leads to mutual demise. Does this sound familiar at all? Recall the introduction to this episode where I described the famous prisoner's dilemma. In this dilemma, if both actors are rational, they end up undermining their effort to minimize time spent in jail. This is to hedge their bets that the other may be untrustworthy. Rationality then leads to the mutual demise of the robbers. The same situation holds in Hobbes' state of nature, only on a societal level. In Hobbes' state of nature, we're under continual threat. We can't trust others because they could be taking advantage of us. Even if we have good intentions, others might not. And this is somewhat akin to the scenario in the prisoner's dilemma, where the accomplice rats on you, but you don't rat on them. This is a suboptimal option in the thought experiment. In the prisoner's dilemma, it results with you going to prison. And in the state of nature, for Hobbes, it would result possibly in your death. Of course, you could also be the nasty person in the situation dealing with a well intentioned other. This would be akin to the scenario in the prisoner's dilemma where you rat on your accomplice, but they don't rat on you. But really, the scenario of the state of nature is most like the option where both prisoners rat on each other. In fact, in the prisoner's dilemma, this scenario represents the most net negative situation. The prisoners will serve a total of 6 years in prison, 3 each. Whereas if one rats on the other and the other doesn't rat on them back, then you only end up with a net 5 years in prison. So net negative, the option where both people rat on each other is the worst. So how are we to escape this horrible situation? How can we guarantee that people will opt for peace? The fourth option, like the fourth option of the prisoner's dilemma, where both actually refrain from ratting on each other. So I think this is actually where things get interesting. Here, Hobbes tells us that we should follow a number of laws of nature. Now, these aren't physical laws in the sense that Newton's laws of motion were considered natural laws or laws of nature. Rather, Hobbes is describing laws that guide our behavior. Think of these as rational principles that we ought to adopt. They're useful rules to guide our conduct. The first two laws are of particular importance, though he goes on to give a bunch of other ones. Go and look at the Leviathan and read for yourself if you're interested in those other laws. It does get quite interesting, but it is beyond the interests of this video. So the first two are roughly as follows. First, when possible, Hobbes thinks that we should endeavor for peace. And when peace isn't possible, war is permissible. This makes intuitive sense. War is a risky position to be in if you're a self-interested person. And there's a chance that you'll lose and be killed, which is not in your interest, so to speak. When it's possible to live in peace, we should. It's in our interest to. It's less risky. It's more stable. Secondly, though, the second law is that in order to achieve peace, we need to sacrifice some of our liberties. Now, recall that in the prisoner's dilemma, the fourth option results in 1 year each in prison. Now, this is some cost to pay, but it's certainly less than the other costs, possibly 3 years or 5 years in prison. So perhaps escaping the state of nature, that's a state of war really, might actually have a cost too. What might that be? Hobbes thinks that to escape the state of nature, we have to sacrifice some degree of our liberty. We wouldn't have the right necessarily to do anything anymore. Civil society requires civil behavior. We wouldn't be able to, murder without recourse or steal without shame or break agreements without a second thought. We'd actually be held accountable. Our liberty or freedom to pursue our own interests as we see fit would become limited. It would become constrained. It would be bounded. While this is the cost, how can it be ensured? Well, in the prisoner's dilemma, it's the rationality of the agents, given the scenario, that drives them to suboptimal decisions or decisions that aren't as good as just, if they were to cooperate with one another. Something in the scenario itself would have to change to actually incentivize the robbers to collaborate with one another and not rat on one another if they're to be considered rational agents. Well, the same holds true for agents in Hobbes's state of nature. Some additional condition is required to ensure that civility is attained. Hobbes suggests that an absolute sovereign, a monarch really, would be necessary and sufficient for guaranteeing that we can start trusting others, opening up the possibility of forming agreements and contracts for our mutual benefit. Why is this? Well, in short, an absolute sovereign would be able to dole out severe punishment with a swift hand to strike fear into the populace. But this fear would serve a function. It would be a functional fear. It would guarantee that possible defectors or bad actors would fall in line and cooperate with others. This would allow people to trust, not that necessarily people have good intentions, um, but that people will follow through on their agreements and contracts with one another. Because if they don't, the sovereign is waiting, ready to punish and show why it's now in our interest to cooperate socially. So, this additional constraint on the decision calculus would actually make it rational for every person in the state of nature to opt into a contract or an agreement to live under the authority of an absolute sovereign. And so enters the concept of a social contract in Hobbes's political philosophy, namely the consent of the people to be ruled by such and such political authority. We'll return to that in a moment. First, though, I'm sure some of you may be wondering why Hobbes says that it is specifically an absolute sovereign that can help us escape the state of nature. Well, in part, it has to do with his concern about sharing power between different political institutions. Recall that Hobbes was alive during the English Civil War, which represented a rather brutal conflict between two political powers or institutions. You had the crown on one side, in King Charles I, and then you had the parliament on the other side. Hobbes took this as evidence that sharing power actually leads to a distrust and ultimately war. We need a singular source of political power to avoid devolving back into the state of nature. Now, the absolute sovereign's role isn't just to walk around punishing people. I'm realizing the way I described it earlier may have given you that impression. The role of the sovereign really is to guarantee peace and well-being among the citizens. The sovereign would make laws, enforce those laws, settle disputes, and other such actions. But if necessary, the sovereign can also crack down with all of its might. For in Hobbesian political philosophy, if ever there was a time for a phrase, might makes right. Now let's return to the social contract. The people in the state of nature decide that it is most rational to enter into an agreement where some transcendent authority can guarantee that people keep their contracts. One of the big takeaways I'd like for you, the listeners, to have from this episode is that the conditions that Hobbes give actually determines the result. Hobbes's state of nature relies on certain conditions, three specifically, and they result in a particularly specific and horrible scenario. If we accept those conditions, That is, that in the state of nature, there's no governing body, people will seek their own advantage, and resources are limited, then it might be that we're stuck in a kind of state of nature game theoretic where the most rational decision for each of the actors is actually to consent to the ruling of an absolute monarch. But one way that we can attack positions like these is to attack the initial conditions of the thought experiment. We can do this by questioning whether these conditions are necessary and accurately describe the hypothetical. Sure, if we grant the conditions, maybe Hobbes has us by the lead, but we shouldn't just grant those conditions. Is it true, for instance, that people will always and necessarily seek their own interest, as many think Hobbes maintains? This is a view that's actually called psychological egoism. It maintains that the motivation for every decision that we make is for our own advantage or somehow seeking or establishing our own interests. But is that true? Is that correct? What of apparently altruistic decisions where a person actually sacrifices their interests for the benefit of another? Well, a psychological egoist could look at these altruistic hypotheticals or examples, and they could probably say that even those decisions are somehow rooted in deeper self interested motivations. But how could such debates, between, call them the altruists and the egoists, how could such debates actually be resolved? Well, the data points are that we're left with are from really self reporting. I did Y because of X reasons. Say a person jumps into a river risking their own life to save a stranger, some child that had slipped into the river. Afterward, they're asked, "Why did you do that? You could have died." Dying would clearly not be in that person's self interest. And we might take this as evidence that psychological egoism is false, that altruism is possible. We can do things without seeking our own interest. But an egoist could just come up with some other explanation for why their decision was actually in their interest. For example, maybe it just proves that they're a helpful member of the group or something along those lines. And so it's worth the risk to risk their lives. So you see, an egoist can always extrapolate further um, possible motivations to justify their claim that all decisions are actually motivated by self-interest. So, as one of my professors used to say, this isn't really a totally fair move. It makes the claim unfalsifiable. Psychological egoism makes a claim that isn't falsifiable. You can't actually argue against it because every explanation that a person might give for an altruistic decision can just be reframed in egoist terms. What are we to do with a position like that? How can you go about proving that every decision is motivated by self interest wrong when you're depending on self reported data? An egoist will always just be able to reframe the decision in self interested terms. And so it doesn't really demonstrate the truth of the claim, only that such an explanation could fit the data. But just because an explanation fits the data doesn't mean the explanation is true. So, what I want you to do is, I want you to think about this puzzle. Are all decisions that we make in life, moral decisions in particular, motivated by self interest? If so, why do you think so? If not, why do you think not? Leave a comment in the comment section. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. So you see, we need to think carefully about these conditions that Hobbes is providing us that yield this position that only an absolute monarch could get us out of the state of nature. And indeed, we'll see in the next episodes that not every philosopher agrees with the conditions provided by Hobbes for the state of nature. And unsurprisingly, those conditions yield very different accounts of the social contract. So we're going to jump into John Locke's political philosophy in our next episode. I'll see you then for another episode of Ideas Through Time. Until then, bye. Thanks so much for watching. Feel free to like this video, subscribe to the channel to keep up with the series. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, it would be truly, truly incredible. You can go to patreon.com/ideas through time to become a member of our growing community. So thank you again. And I hope to see you all for another episode next week. Bye for now.